Lecture 9, the 30th of June 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, in the session before last, I drew your attention to the very difficult social theoretical problem of whether there is a primacy of power relations over the economy, or of the economy over power relations, and to the term leonine contract, which I interpreted to mean that social power already asserts itself in the exchange contract on which the employment relationship rests. But I told you that I did not know its origin. I had completely forgotten it. Now some of you were kind enough to inform me that the motif of the leonine contract comes from Aesop, the ancient Greek fabulist, and from Phaedrus, a Hellenistic fabulist from the time of Caesar Augustus. So that is the source of the phrase. I am glad I was able to add this. Now let us return to where we left off. You will recall my saying last time that a false identity between the general and the particular is emerging, meaning that, in a great many areas of life, the particular already seems so deformed by nature, having internalized and embraced the deformation visited upon it, that the rupture between the general and the particular is no longer properly visible. And I spoke of a negative unity of society in its overall unfreedom. If one wanted to be very spiteful and mocking, one could almost say that we have arrived at a parody of classless society, and I also pointed out that countless conflicts reveal the damage done time and again to individual people, that this unity, which the prevailing ideology considers one of the essential concerns, to use the popular word, to assure us of and to drill into us as a positive, that it is actually a mere semblance, that this integration is not true. I will only add here, after we have so far concerned ourselves mostly with the question of the workers, that this aspect is by no means a matter for the working classes or the underclass, for the phenomenon I am describing to you, namely the semblance of freedom that is created only by a certain visible satisfaction of needs, without any change to one's real status in the production process, also manifests itself in the ruling view, which is naturally extremely narrow, namely in the fact that even the members of the ruling class have infinitely less freedom of choice, and also far less opportunity to enjoy their property and their independence, than one imagines. Already in my youth I was surprised how little use the richest people whom I had the chance to study actually made of their wealth for personal enjoyment, and there was a very concrete reason for that. Aside from an internalization of the Puritan work ethic, it was quite simply a fear of attracting attention. Today there is undoubtedly a tacit, extremely widespread social regulation which ensures that anyone who uses their wealth unreservedly exposes themselves to a sphere of, shall we say, petty bourgeois scrutiny that not only spoils the enjoyment they might otherwise have had but in addition, and this is far more important, could also lead to all manner of commercial disadvantages. Such a man would immediately be suspected of being a playboy, would be viewed as dubious, and the amusement he indulged in would immediately lessen his credit, and thus possibly the material basis for that same freedom which he cannot wholeheartedly enjoy. This already points to an objective aspect of this situation, and Marx also saw this with full clarity, which is one of the reasons that, for all his scathing criticism, his hatred was directed far more at ideologues than at the members of the ruling class as persons, namely that, within a system defined by the necessity of accumulating and exploiting capital, the individual people appear, to an almost unimaginable degree, merely as character masks '1 or, put more simply, as functionaries of the capital relation, which determines every one of their decisions and naturally, in case of conflict, necessarily sugs in their private life too, in so far as a thin layer of semblance still distinguishes it from professional life, whether partially or completely. So here, too, one can say that the apparent leveling that reveals itself in the comparison between the lifestyles of the haves and the have-nots, is a semblance that conceals coercion, oppression and forced adaptation. Perhaps I can say at this point that, to me, the significance of exploring and criticizing ideologies lies primarily in the fact that, in the ideologies, one can show to a large extent what I am talking about, namely the semblance of society's freedom. By analyzing the ideologies that are promoted today, especially those provided by the culture industry, one can see how much the antagonisms live on, despite the semblance of leveling, simply through those constant efforts to make people forget the antagonisms, through that intention which evidently makes its presence felt, simply under the pressure of the reality of the antagonisms, and which accordingly, as Goethe puts it in Torquato Tasso, like every intention that is noticed, causes annoyance. One need not stop at this annoyance, however, one can elevate it to a concept, that is, one can show in detail that such ideology, especially where, with a form of pseudo-realism, it seemingly presents people merely with an image of their own reality, falsifies this reality by making the central antagonisms disappear and replacing them with merely private conflicts, always characterized by the fact that they remain in the private sphere and can be resolved privately. Always is an exaggeration. Incidentally, naturally the culture industry also includes a great many products seemingly connected to so-called social issues, but that is precisely where the falsifications are carried out most cunningly, and it would almost be more important to expose the illusory nature of so-called social tearjerkers than the rather spurious private ideologies which seek to persuade the shop girl that the boss is only waiting to marry her. I am talking about these things so that you might understand, as we are speaking here about a theory of society and must therefore consider the status of individual sociological interests, why the analysis of the products of mass culture, of the culture industry or of ideology forms a not inconsiderable part of my own work. Today one can say that this ideology no longer consists so much in offering people complementary ideas that deviate from reality and comfort them, because exactly this ideological procedure evidently no longer promises enough success in the face of a humanity that has become increasingly sophisticated through technology and communication. Rather, it seems that ideology today merges to an ever greater degree with the image of reality as it actually is, so that, to refer to Max Weber once again, the disenchanted world in addition to everything else, is glorified as its own meaning or its own ideology. I say glorified because the presentation of this world creates the impression that it must be so, that it cannot be any other way, and that, what is more, this is something very profound. If, in the context of science theoretical argumentation, I keep having occasion or feel the need to criticize the prevailing positivist mindset in the social sciences, then you will probably find in what I have just said, goodness knows I have no intention of fooling you, the true motive that inspires me, namely that I believe positivism itself to be a manifestation of ideology today, and an especially dangerous one, because the positivist mindset declares itself the most anti-ideological, sober, objective one of all, but, by rejecting everything that is not a fact, through this exclusivity of the factual, it bestows an aura upon factuality that is generally drawn from the very same metaphysics which the current positivists consider such a taboo. So that is why, when I inveigh against positivism, just to dispel any doubts you might have, to make this point fully clear to you, it is not with the intention of salvaging, in opposition to positivism and for the sake of the social reality in which we live, something like a positive meaning in that which is the case as something existent, but rather the opposite. The point of my critique of the positivist method is, in fact, precisely to prevent the reflection of merely existent facts, whose falsity is not even judged according to any theory, from fraudulently claiming, for Timaeus, 3 the very meaning whose non-existence is so often the object of these theorems. Perhaps I could draw your attention to the significance which the concept of the human being, der Mensch, has taken on today, and which I addressed in an essay, The Jargon of Authenticity, which appeared some time ago in Die Neuronsch and which I turned into a book of the same name, with the subtitle on German ideology, which will be published in November in the edition Sucham series, 4, and in which I think I managed to show something, namely the connection between immanent philosophical and social analysis on the one hand and ideology critique on the other. In this book, and I am only telling you this to illustrate the specific nature of ideology today, and at the same time the tasks of an ideology critique, I dealt with the concept of the human being, the only one that counts, and at least tried to show, you yourselves must judge whether or not I succeeded in this, how the assertion that it is always a matter of the human being and nothing else, that only the human being matters, that this, if one could one day conceive a typology of ideologies, is what one might call a complementary ideology, because, in this world that is completely dominated by social objectivity, it is precisely not the human being, the individual subject, that matters. That is why, purely through the language, the tone, that a word like human takes on in linguistic configurations, there is an impression of the opposite, namely that the machinery in which we are actually viewed purely as prospective customers, that this really exists for our sake, and that this is where the purpose of it all lies. The interesting thing here is that, if one examines such things seriously, one must do so in an extremely nuanced fashion. It is precisely the most brutal phenomenon that can only be grasped adequately through an extremely high degree of sensitivity and nuance, and here I will say that the important and telling thing is that, when the human being is presented as something meaningful, this concept of the human is thus robbed of any meaningful relationship, and it seems as if one need only say a human being with a verbal roll of the eyes, as it were, and this will prove how meaningful a human is. The simple reason for this is that, as soon as the ideologues claimed some positive transcendence on the part of this human being, it would immediately bring them into conflict with the ruling state of enlightenment, or rather jadedness, among their consumers. So they have no choice but to employ their taboo words, their sacred words, as precisely that, as sacred words, because any attempt to define their content in some way or other would immediately turn into an outright lie, which would immediately bring all the fun to an abrupt end. This also shows you a very peculiar dialectic, in the sense that, because the existent telco, the way it is made the ideology of itself today, when there are not really any meaningful ideologies left, the ideology of truth moves extremely close, creating the impression that one has only to pull a little and the ideological veil will fall. But it strikes me as a sociological law that, the thinner the veil between reality and ideology becomes, the more difficult it becomes to destroy this veil, and that if there is no ideology left anyway, as it were, then the ideological, that is, reified consciousness will have reached its greatest height. If I am not mistaken, this phenomenon is one reason why ideology critique must primarily and essentially become a language critique, to an extent that Karl Kraus already saw and aimed for as an artist, though in his case this was still separate from the theoretical consciousness of society, and this critique must be informed by an explicit consciousness of society if it is to be truly fruitful. The antagonisms of which I have spoken, let me repeat this, are, at least in the most developed countries, no longer directly visible as antagonisms of property and lack, even though, as I told you, there is still no absence of, how should I put it, decisive proof of antagonistic circumstances today. Rather, they reveal themselves through the growth of the extremes of social power and social powerlessness, which leave those people who, according to ideology, are all that matters in a state of complete nullity, as indeed the idea of nothingness usually accompanies the ideologies of the human being or, as they are more nobly termed, of existence, Dasein. But I cannot carry out this critique now. I can refrain with a clearer conscience because in a few months you will have opportunity to read this for yourselves, demonstrated, as it were, by the most philosophically substantial carrier of this sort of ideology, at least in German. 5 But if one asserts, as I just tried to show you, that social antagonisms still exist and are extremely effective, then one is immediately tempted to suggest, because they are so substantial, that one accept them as something directly present, as simple facts. But that, and I consider it my duty, on this central point, to address you as unideologically and honestly as I possibly can, would be just as wrong, in its own way, as the mistake I have criticized and whose correction is the purpose of ideology critique, namely to deny the existence of antagonisms and pretend that, thanks to technology, we have come so wonderfully far that there are no longer any contradictions, without people giving much thought to how technology alone is supposed to achieve that without substantially affecting the conditions of social production. On the other hand, there is also what one could describe as the danger of mythologizing those antagonisms, something strongly evident in notions that were still widespread in the Eastern Bloc not so long ago, namely that in capitalist countries, in Chicago, for example, there were starving workers hanging around outside the factories or lying in the streets. In the East, this went so far that the major economic analyst Eugen Varga, who went against official Eastern theory by crediting capitalism with an initially unlimited viability, was expelled from his position and banished for this prognosis, which has been fully confirmed in the meantime, and, if I am correctly informed, he was brought back to Russia only as a very old man after the death of Stalin and after the changes in Russia that you are all familiar with. Directly in parallel with these deformations one can observe in the East, one finds such constructions as the idea that obviously virulent social antagonisms, for example those in China, are treated as if they were not antagonisms at all but, rather, and the very word deserves to be exhibited, as non-antagonistic contradictions. I did not invent this word, ladies and gentlemen. From what I am telling you here, one must surely draw one conclusion about the very fundamental questions we are dealing with, namely that one cannot hammer a theory into people against their own experience and that, as soon as the kind of discrepancies between theory and experience that I have described appear, when the theory of antagonisms runs amok, then something is wrong with the theory itself, at least in the established form that is imposed on people. The task of a theory of society today, and this, I think, takes us to one of the central difficulties faced by the conception and formulation of such a theory of society today, is that it must incorporate even what is contrary to it, what deviates from it, and, if one proceeds from this point, one can open up a new way to the concept of dialectics as a theory that is capable of incorporating even those elements which are theoretically contrary to it at first. This would not be the worst definition of dialectics, if indeed one insists on such a definition, and at this moment the concept of dialectics is meant subjectively, in the sense of a theory of society, but naturally the concept of dialectic also has an objective meaning, namely the antagonistic process of society itself, of which I would like to remind you. In other words, one must also grasp the rupture between theory and experience theoretically, which is a great deal to demand of a theory. In the structure of the East which I described to you, which certainly includes the phenomena one keeps hearing about, namely that the naive citizens of the Soviet Union believe that, for example, the radio or underground trains were invented in Russia and that the Moscow Underground is the first of its kind, then this is still relatively simple. What I mean is that here one can simply say that the fetishization of theory in relation to experience and the facts corresponds directly to the ruling clique's need for power and thus constitutes an ideology of obfuscation, an ideology of idealization, in the most basic and concrete sense. But such innocent and, I would say, clumsy explanations are not sufficient in the area I am telling you about, namely the rupture between theory and experience. Rather, one probably has to say that, on the one hand, people are disappointed and skeptically opposed to theories that try to talk them into ideologies. They distrust theory formation in general, but that, on the other hand, they are increasingly incapable of experience in subjective and anthropological terms, that their ability to have a primary experience is withering away, and they are thus willing to make do with substitutes for experience which no longer enable a confrontation between what they view as experience and what is actually the case. The few people who have theoretically elaborated on this loss of experience, this imminent loss of experience, and whom you know to be connected in their theoretical convictions, such as Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse and myself, have done so at such length and in such detail that I can restrict myself here simply to emphasizing the value of such insights within an overall theoretical conception of society, without having to repeat the individual reasons for this loss of experience. There is just one curiosity that I cannot refrain from mentioning. An Italian philosopher, Count Castelli, who is strongly influenced by German essential ontology and certainly does not proceed from the social theoretical considerations with which I am molesting you here, wrote a book about the concept of time in which he develops the thesis that, in fact, people today are no longer truly capable of experiencing time at all. 7 Some have even gone so far as to view the current boom in the metaphysics of time as a form of complement to this inability, arguing that people today think so much about time and therefore consider it the key to being because time has essentially become problematic for them and attracts thought because the continuity of temporal experience has fallen apart, a thesis with which I would certainly agree, albeit with the modification that I think this collapse of temporal experience ultimately refers back to the form taken by the work process today. It is naturally a great deal to ask if, as I do, one demands that a theory should incorporate these aspects, the near inevitable deviations from every self-contained, thoroughly structured theory, or that must be the initial impression, at least, and this diminishes the plausibility of the theories themselves and now forces us to address in earnest the concept of theory itself, and especially, in connection with that, the concept of theory as a system. On the other hand, it must be said, and perhaps this is actually a justification for a theory that has so little to do with the traditional concept of theory, that, without such a theory, it is impossible to deal with the extraordinarily complex situation of our historical moment at all. And let me add one more thing, the reflections on this which I presented to you in the last session, and which I would like to think that some of you found somewhat plausible and convincing, that they are really parts of such a theory of society, with the methodological peculiarity that, in them, the theory refers to itself through critical reflection. Now we must move on. The timing is very unfavorable, as the lecture is almost over and we must really begin a new section, to an examination of such concepts as a theory of society, the system and everything connected to these things. If you think back for 1 second to what I have just told you about the necessity for the theory to incorporate the irresolvable elements, those aspects to which the theory qua theory cannot be reduced, one might also take the view that theory today is forced to be at once system and non-system, a system insofar as it must express the wholeness and unity of society that we encounter, or at least encounter as a potential, and to which I refer you, but on the other hand also a non-system insofar as it has transpired that this wholeness itself reproduces the antagonisms, that this unity itself, in its absoluteness, creates precisely this division by its own nature. One might also say that a theory of society must itself be rational in a twofold sense. On the one hand, it reveals the rationality of society, as indeed everything in this society happens as it should, according to its rules. On the other hand, it is also rational in the sense that it does not simply acknowledge the elements of irrationality displayed by society in countless aspects as a corrective, that would leave us with precisely the sort of patchwork theory with which we cannot content ourselves, but rather, in principle at least, elaborates the irrationalities of the prevailing society from the very nature of its own rationality. So that would really be the idea, or, if you prefer, the model or archetype, of the only theory of society that seems possible and certainly necessary to me today. And I would like to take this opportunity to say that this demand for theory was at least registered by Max Weber, to the extent that, with a degree of freedom and loyalty, one could interpret what he did, including his own doctrine of science, as showing that he held on to the idea of theory in the sense of a rational unlocking of society, in the sense of understanding, as he put it, but at the same time refrained from giving this the form of a system of society and instead tried to demonstrate the entire structure micrologically using individual models that he constructed. That would be a recuperation of the concept of the ideal type, as it were, in terms of what knowledge is possible today, albeit a recuperation that I know Max Weber would certainly fight tooth and nail if he were alive today. Lecture 10. The 2nd of July 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last session we began to apply the more or less material sociological reflections we had undertaken with reference to a theory of society, and I tried to ask what that means for the concept of our theory, and at the same time to investigate the concept of theory itself, the traditional concept of theory. We had reached the stage where the indifference point we were confronted with, in comparison to the naive notion of theory, was that reality which ultimately dictates the rules for any theory that seeks to grasp or recognize it, is internally contradictory, and that any theoretical construct whose highest value is the absence of contradictions will therefore contradict its very object, even as it flatters itself that it has mastered it with the utmost logical elegance and soundness. One could say that reality is itself both logical and illogical. Now that is nothing really new, it is an inherent structural determinant of bourgeois society. Marx already viewed society as rational and examined its own claim that everything is in order, with commodities being exchanged for their equivalents, and this is exactly the dialectical salt in Marx's theory of society, showed, or at least tried to show, that precisely because everything proceeds as it should, because equal is exchanged for equal, everything is not in order, for the principle of equality results in inequality, whether created or reproduced. This may remind you of a thought I sought to convey to you in the previous session with greater or lesser success, namely that social antagonisms established themselves because of their integration, not in spite of it, perpetuating and possibly consolidating power structures within society. But, in the older type of theory, this aspect I just mentioned did not emerge as clearly as I think it must emerge today. That is, and this is historically quite understandable, people tried for too long to come to terms with an internally contradictory and antagonistic society using a concept of contradiction-free and unified theory. Incidentally, you can see that the assertion of the link between rationality and irrationality, indeed their interconnection, is not something that was inserted into the equation after the event by the fact that, in the classically rational formulation of a theory of society, namely Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, in addition to the laws of exchange that he defines objectively, the author already introduced the principle of fair play, which subsequently entered everyday language, even the German language. So this means that the entire construction applies only if certain irreducibly rational moral laws are followed, laws whose essence is that one should follow the rules of the game. One could say that, here in particular, one finds one of the central reasons why such strictly rational models are no longer adequate for understanding society, namely that society is increasingly disregarding its own defined rational rules. When Hitler, for example, to give you a very drastic illustration, we analyze these things a little in Dialectic of Enlightenment 1, makes a contract, then declares that he hopes Mr. Chamberlain, or whoever it might be, will be reasonable and see sense, then reason here no longer means upholding a rational contract based on rational laws. Rather, if one analyzes it, it means he should recognize that he, Mr. Hitler, has more numerous and more powerful cannons, at least at the time of presenting such demands, and that Chamberlain should therefore yield to his power. So, in this phase, the same reason that once insisted precisely on following the rules is emancipated from keeping to the rules and now becomes what it was not in its better days, a recognition of the respectively prevailing, blind power. If I can just skim a little cream off the top of that for a philosophical theory of society, I would say it shows that, even a category such as reason, which was taken as an invariant formal logical rule, for example by Kant, as a permanently self-identical and eternal category, changes with the structures of society. So this means that, if one is the weaker party facing an outwardly incredibly powerful and aggressive dictatorship, the reasonable thing to do is precisely the opposite of the concept of reason, the contradiction of reason as classically understood, though with the addition of the specifically fascist dynamic, where reason itself now turns into manifest unreason. So, that covers the relationship between rational and irrational elements in society, and I consider it especially important for you to understand that rational and irrational elements do not exist alongside each other in society, as one might think after a more or less topographical assessment of society. Certainly that is also true. What I mean is that, on the one hand, there is an incredible degree of technological rationalization while, on the other hand, say in the organization of agriculture, agriculture can only survive if the weaker family members, women and children, are exploited in the most irrational fashion because the family is respected as having absolute value. That is an example of this coexistence of rationality and irrationality. But what I mean is something much more far-reaching, and I think it also shows you a little what I have in mind when I speak of a philosophical theory of society as opposed to a descriptive theory of society, namely that the rationality within the prevailing conditions, that is, rational work, calculation, financial accounting, where the stronger party receives the maximum benefit, that this rationality itself naturally produces the irrational elements, or, if it does not produce them directly, it is at least the reason why, despite all the particular and partial rationalizations in our society, the irrational sectors survive, indicating in a sense that the whole, in all its rationality, has remained something irrational after all. The fact that the reality which the theory needs to grasp is an antagonistic reality in this very radical sense, a sense that can be dated back to the concept of its own reasonableness, demands a dialectical theory, as formulating a dialectical theory of society, quite simply means understanding the inner workings of society in such a way that one elaborates these irrationalities from its own concept. So this brings us to the same matter I explained to you in the last few sessions, insisting that one of the central tasks of a theory of society, and of sociology in general, is to understand even those aspects that seemingly contradict a unified theory formation. And a theory that is capable of grasping precisely those things that elude the traditional concept of deductive theory is the exact elaboration of this paradox, if you will. That is really what can be expected of a dialectical theory, which is anathema to the conventional attitudes with which we are all infused, and this is the real effort which I would say that both philosophy and sociology demand of you. In this respect, I would think, there is in fact no difference between the two disciplines. I will not go into the reasons for that now. At any rate, the task with which we are confronted is quite simply to liberate ourselves from the notion that, simply put, the best and truest and most adequate theory is that which is most coherent and contradiction-free in an immediate sense, without consideration for what the reality actually is and what reality imposes on us. Naive thinking, and this naivety, ladies and gentlemen, by no means refers merely to pre-scientific thinking but, rather, is a naivety that I would argue is possibly hardened and consolidated in us by the traditional concept of science and its classificatory structures, insists on a kind of choice. Here we are expected to choose all or nothing, to think in binary terms. So the demand is to select either theory in the sense of a contradiction-free, possibly deductive or at least unanimously organized system, or, if one stumbles on the fact that this system is not without problems, that something is lacking, one immediately throws the entire system overboard and says, so, our faith in systems - people especially like to speak of faith - has been shaken, which means that we must do without any system. So all one has to do is start with a clean slate, without prejudices, as they say, collect facts and arrange them into an order. This form of binary thinking is precisely what undialectical thinking means, namely a form of thinking which simply distinguishes between two opposing possibilities and demands that we choose between them, as it were, without asking whether the extremes thus defined might not actually condition one another, or, as one says in the language of dialectics, whether they are not mutually mediated. It seems to me and you will forgive me if I speak in a rather pedagogical manner, though on the other hand it is not pedagogical, because I am simply stating it very openly. It seems to me that, of all the thinking habits with which people generally approach theory, one of the most dangerous is to do so with demands that stem from their own needs rather than being immanent to theory itself, in particular such needs where one simply cannot say a priori whether a theory will fulfill them. For example, to describe a very common and, in my opinion, very dangerous way of thinking, when people demand time and again that a theory should give us instructions for correct action and possibly a correct practice here and now, it is dogmatically assumed that theory is capable of this, whereas one can certainly imagine situations which are so deadlocked that the famous direct transition from theory to practice is impossible, and that theory consequently does not simply lead to consequences, except that life will become a little more uncomfortable because one sees that all exits are blocked and no theory can provide the keys to them. And this leads precisely to that anti-theoretical stance which says, well, if a theory doesn't give us that, we'd rather throw it away altogether. Obviously, this may serve only to reinforce the dull-minded insistence that things are simply one way and no other. It is the same if one approaches theory with a need for absolute security of knowledge, be it a security elaborated from a concept purely on the model of mathematics or a security of absolutely indisputable facts, and it is highly characteristic of this way of thinking that it essentially always operates with this all-or-nothing approach. So either a theory should produce everything at once of its own accord or, if it cannot do that, if the slightest bit of reality protrudes from it, as it were, in such a way that it cannot be elaborated entirely from the theory itself, then the whole thing is worth nothing at all. Brecht once formulated that rather brilliantly with reference to bourgeois thinking in general, saying that only bourgeois thinking is actually radical, not a critique of bourgeois thinking, which the members of the bourgeoisie find so radical, so worrying and terribly dangerous. 2. I think this is especially true of the attitude towards the concept of theory. This all or nothing dash, I already touched on this, is quite simply the demand that theory should satisfy the need for absolute security of knowledge, instead of knowledge being determined by what is actually known, however difficult that may be to achieve. According to the traditional view, one might say that these certainly correspond to the system deduced mathematically from the concept or, on the other hand, pure facticity. This way of thinking, the traditional way, is quite simply incapable of behaving openly, open in the sense that it does not replace the matter itself with the criterion of consistency of theory or knowledge but, rather, considers the matter itself, which is naturally always mediated by our means of acquiring knowledge, the terminus ad quem, not the method one chooses to apply. I think that, if I had to describe to you what the predominant mood in the entire social sciences is today, and if I simultaneously had to define as concisely as possible the point of difference where the way of thinking that I espouse, and which I share with a few other people who are also familiar to you, diverges from this prevailing habit, then it is this: for countless people working in the field of social science, it is more important to have something like a unified theory covering as many things as possible, with enough space to accommodate whatever facts one finds, than to have, instead of such a sociological theory designed to act as the measure of what is true or false, a theory of society that is not so unified in itself, namely one that reflects the nature of society. This glorification of unified knowledge at the cost of truth, which is not unified, essentially amounts to what I wish to describe as the fetishization of science. The general fetish character of commodities, which has long since spread to countless so-called intellectual goods, this being precisely what has reduced intellectual goods to intellectual goods, this fetish character has finally also taken over the concept of science, which is now being replaced by its own object and has taken it as an absolute in an act of obedience and respect towards its own rules. This is roughly the context in which I would ask you, if I might speak a little topologically, to see the matters concerning the critique of current academic life which I outlined in my text Philosophy and Teachers, 3, and especially in Note on the Humanities and Education in Interventions. 4. I will not expand on the things I wrote there but instead tell you a little about this change in the function of science, for I think that, if one takes my earlier demand seriously, the one concerning an open approach, then this is possible only by adopting a very pointed critical stance towards science that respects it but does not fetishize it. Just let me add that the open aspect, which I increasingly tend towards viewing as a key concept, that this, and this is perhaps very telling, by no means comes from the philosophical tradition, although philosophers such as the American John Dewey have used the term, but it was actually, in our German tradition, at least, H. Oldderlin who used it with the emphasis I wish to give it, and I would say that he is of incomparably greater weight, philosophically speaking, than is thought by those who believe they can consign him to the special realm of poetry, but also, and this is almost worse, by those who would presume to mythologize him. So now, ad vocem science, you must be aware, ladies and gentlemen, that the concept of science has gone through an immense change of function, and that this category too, whose incredible practical successes have increasingly led it to tout itself as the only manifestation of truth, that this category too is interwoven with the whole of social life and the totality of consciousness, and that it takes on highly varied meanings within it. First of all, the concept of science was used polemically against the dogmatism of the Church and the related realist philosophy. So its point was that one should not presume anything that is not seen clear yet distinct by the individually thinking, judging mind, and, at the beginning of the modern age, the leaders of the two feuding schools of philosophy, namely Bacon and Descartes, were entirely in agreement on that point. Both of them directed the concept of science in the same way against merely traditional, dogmatically adopted knowledge. Then, in a process shaped primarily by the increasingly consistent development of the great rationalist systems, the concept of science as the production of the world from pure thought established itself in more and more radical ways, finally becoming the concept of absolute knowledge '7 as an absolute consciousness and absolute reality that produces itself from itself. Naturally, this is already implicit in the idea of mathematical deducibility that runs through the whole of Spinoza's philosophy, 8, and, perhaps in far more exemplary fashion, perhaps most blatantly, in a sense, in Leibniz's theorem, 9, which essentially boils down to the fact that every monad, and, to speak with a certain largesse, without overly close analysis of the object itself, that every individual really carries the entire universe within itself without realizing it and can produce it purely from within itself, through its own thought. From Leibniz one learns about such things as pre-established harmony or the doctrine of the representation of the universe in the monad, but, if you learn that in the usual philosophy historical way, you will often not realize that this amounts to this incredible claim that science, as the epitome of the self-generating whole, equals the absolute truth. Consequently, the Leibnizian concept of a mathesis universalis, a rational universal science, is connected to the doctrine of pre-established harmony and the productive imagination of the monad in a way that is far from merely superficial. Rather, these two major tendencies in Leibniz's philosophy are directly linked in their innermost motivations. So this now grows into the doctrine of the absolute character of science as the attempt to elaborate the totality of everything that exists from the philosophical concept itself, as first shown formally and expounded methodologically with the greatest precision by Fichte, before Hegel attempted, with a force that was never achieved again, to apply it in every detail. If you read Fichte or Hegel, if you read phrases such as doctrine of science '10 or science of phenomenal consciousness '11 in Hegel, you can only understand the concept of science if you perceive its twofold character, namely that, on the one hand, it follows on from the incredible progress of rational science made in the modern age, but, on the other hand, it is almost taken for granted from the outset, presenting the claim that this science itself is actually the phenomenal absolute, a claim, moreover, that, in a certain sense, was already present in the far more cautious and less, how shall I put it, less self-indulgent Kant, for Kant doubts and critically analyzes all manner of things, but never questions the validity of science itself. I cannot provide you with a history of the concept of science here, so let me just say this much. With the decline of the great idealistic philosophy, all that really remains of this equation of science with truth is the absolute certainty of the individual insights as its truth. This means that the sole concern of the science which later developed from this philosophy, naturally both through immanent development and, even more so, from the immanent development of the individual sciences, was that the scientific method and its results should be in order, be coherent, regardless of how accurately this grasped the matter in question, and without one's consciousness becoming entangled in doubts as to how far it could even be grasped adequately as a matter. One might also say what the fetishism of science means is that the division of labor which led to the separation of a specialist branch, namely science with its fixed methods, has been turned into an absolute, or at least glorified, such that this newly grown branch, science, from which anyone remotely organizationally involved in it derives not only their material existence but also their social status and their prestige, that this branch is the index sui or the index veriet falsi, without genuinely reflecting on its own preconditions. And this is taken to its ultimate conclusion in modern positivism, which, if one describes it in these terms, essentially states that philosophy should really consist of nothing but the epitome of scientific procedures, not reflected upon but only abstracted and distilled. One might even say that science, in the context of the overall nominalist tendency to focus on the outward aspects of things and to slur any insight into their inner workings as speculation, becomes its own most precious commodity, the summum bonum, the more it actually dispenses with truly understanding anything. Similarly, in the social sciences, to put this in a specific social scientific context, it was one of the most famous sociologists of the previous generation, Emile Durkheim, who made it a criterion of sociology that it does not grasp but, rather, works on its objects comme des choses, that is, from the outside and using merely classificatory methods, refraining from actual comprehension, 12 which is dismissed as a sort of metaphysical prejudice. So here the approach of science towards its terminus ad chem, namely the unlocking of the matter itself, is directly made the norm. One could also say that the method posits itself in place of the truth while, in reality, it is really nothing but the means for the recognition of the truth. But the tendency to substitute means for ends is, for very profound social reasons, so much a part of the foundations of bourgeois thought as such that the habit I just defined to you, as a universal tendency of bourgeois thought, probably needs to be addressed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you not to misunderstand me, and especially not to take my criticism, my very fundamental and also mediated criticism of science, as anything like a rejection of science in favor of intuitionism or some other such thing. I would like to think that the continuity of what I am saying protects me somewhat from such misunderstandings by the well-disposed among you, but, on the other hand, the fact that one cannot say everything in a single statement means that one repeatedly finds oneself in danger of such misunderstandings. So, let me make this highly necessary correction. Naturally, it is not as if the methods of science have nothing to do with the object, for the sharpening of scientific tools, the refinement of the criteria one uses in order to assess the validity of scientific theorems, of course means that something of the matter asserts itself. This means that what is ruled out as impossible by these criteria are very often simply the idols, as Bacon puts it, 13 that place themselves in the way of our knowledge of the objects and deceive us. So it would be an abstract separation of subject and object, of method and matter, if I said that the development of methodology as such simply prevents an understanding of the matter. In a sense, The fact that the method becomes more and more critically refined, and rules out more and more things that are not methodologically applicable, brings us closer to the matter, which is why I have no intention whatsoever of opposing the sharpening of scientific standards with a loosening of scientific norms, criteria and validity. But it does ultimately make a decisive difference whether the method and its consistency, the coherence of the method, is made the summum bonum of the scientific method, with everything measured in relation to this ideal, or whether reflection on a matter might possibly be capable not of abolishing or suspending the scientific rules, but of pushing them towards a reflection that reveals objective areas in which the norms established by science are simply not adequate to grasp reality. If one proceeds from what I have told you, namely that the scientific method would come closer to the heart of the matter through its own critical purification, if I can put it like that, if one simply and straightforwardly infers from this that, the more purely the scientific method is designed, the more smoothly and directly it leads us to the matter itself, then this is precisely where the mistake lies, which leads to science obstructing our view of the truth. And what really leads me to oppose the currently prevailing social scientific ambitions of sociological systems in particular is their fundamental assumption that the most elegant, taking the word in its mathematical sense, possible construction of the scientific apparatus corresponds to a higher degree of truth, so that, wherever this form of elegance more mathematico is dispensed with, it has a fundamental effect on the truth of the thoughts themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, I am well aware that I have managed to demonstrate this to you only in formal terms. I also realize that I genuinely owe it to you at least to illustrate this point, which is of central importance for a theory of society, using a concrete model. I will do that in the next session and will refer to the teachings of Talcott Parsons, who, as you may know, sees it as one of the most essential methodological aspects of the so-called human sciences to develop them from a certain minimum of categories, and I will try to show you next time, with reference to a central point, that this is impossible and why it is impossible. Lecture 11. The 7th of July 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin today by presenting the problem I would like to discuss with you in the most concise and clear terms, because it is important to me that you truly understand very clearly what I wish to convey to you. I wish to show you that the ideal of the scientific method which is familiar to you from the positive sciences, especially the natural sciences, does not contribute to the truth in the social context but, rather, can counteract the truth in a determinable sense, because the structure of this context does not correspond to what the traditional ideal of science, which is not itself philosophical, demands. To this end, I would like to refer back briefly to the tradition of philosophy. In the Discourse on Method by Descartes, one who has in a sense remained canonical for scientifically oriented philosophical thought, despite all changes, the third of his principles, the third rule, is to guide my thoughts in an orderly way by beginning with the objects that are the simplest and easiest to know and to rise gradually, as if by steps, to knowledge of the most complex, and even by assuming an order among objects in cases where there is no natural order among them. 2. It is very interesting, and I will point out to you in passing that Descartes himself was evidently not fully at ease with this principle, as he said that he assumed this order, this gradual succession in the matter itself, even where one cannot suppose such a gradual ascent naturally, that is, in the matter itself. If one reads a text such as the Discourse on Method through a magnifying glass, and I think that the only fruitful way to read philosophical texts at all is to read them extremely closely, in a certain kind of immersion, then one can already discover in this unassuming statement the very thing we are considering today, namely the conflict between the postulates of scientific method on the one hand and the structure of the matter on the other. This problem was simply spirited away by the subsequent rationalists, by Spinoza in the dogmatic assertion that the order of ideas and the order of things is the same, and by Leibniz in a far more refined and detailed way by applying the principle of continuity, the principle that nature does not make any leaps, and that the sleeplessness in things themselves corresponds to a leapless way of thinking. And then, as his next rule, Descartes demands that, in all cases, one should make such comprehensive enumerations and such general reviews that one is certain not to omit anything. 3 It is hence the postulate of a gradual progression that makes no leaps, from the perspective of a possibly attainable completeness. And Leibniz then refined this, in keeping with the advances in mathematics, by replacing this graduated, I would almost say semi-medievally hierarchical sequence of subject areas with infinitesimal rather than gradual transitions, infinitely small crossings of boundaries, which are intended genuinely to allow completely seamless transitions from one thing to the next. For now, I will pass over one problem that will become central later, namely the assumption that the first thing is at once the simplest, or, put differently, that the intrinsic aspects from which one would have to proceed to the epiphenomena are at once the simplest, and everything else follows from them. Perhaps you have noticed that, in Descartes, the dogmatic, arbitrary assertion accompanies the openness of the first great discoveries with unmistakable clarity. But I will concern myself all the more with the demand for an absence of leaps or the demand for continuity, of infinitesimal continuity, in Leibniz. For although these philosophies themselves, after Hume's critique, for then Kant's, and then the entire positivism of the 19th and 20th centuries, are barely recognized as valid for the individual scientific disciplines, it is nonetheless the case, peculiarly enough, that a postulate such as the one I just picked out for you continues to be relatively undisputed in the sciences, especially in the organization of the sciences. It is a strange business that while, on the one hand, this specifically scientific pathos, if one wants to call it pathos, this emphasis on being scientific in the specific sense, has something so anti-philosophical about it that many positivist scientists essentially mean it as an insult when they call a philosopher. This has happened to me in various contexts of late, so I am speaking from experience, and yet, on the other hand, it is precisely these positive sciences, because they have become so distant or estranged from the advances in philosophical reflection, that unthinkingly carry all manner of baggage with them from the very philosophy they have declared obsolete, baggage that now, in fact, obstructs the matter itself. Within the field of the social sciences, then, in the form that prevails today, it is more or less expressly demanded that the so-called human sciences, as one calls them, using a highly problematic phrase, join together as seamlessly as possible, that they form a type of continuum. There initially seems to be a solid support in this term human science, because these sciences seem to share a basic category, namely the human being, which, so they conclude, remains the same thing whether it is the substrate of biology, psychology, sociology or economics. In terms of established scientific logic, this also means that, as far as possible, the same categories should appear in all these so-called sciences, and, this would be the mathematicizing continuation. The smaller the number of basic categories used for this, the greater the scientific dignity of this entire complex known as the human sciences. This ideal I have just outlined for you was explicitly formulated in one of the most effective, or probably the most effective, systematic exposition of sociology that exists today, namely that of Parsons, 5, which you have all at least heard of, and which many of you specifically concerned with sociology have probably looked at more closely. In 2 texts, produced in collaboration with the extremely epistemologically oriented American, formerly Austrian, psychoanalyst Heinz Hartmann 6, Parsons essentially postulated the demand for such a uniform conceptual system, both for depth psychology and for sociology. So here you have very clear demands for a unified method covering several scientific branches, characterized by uniform categories of conceptualization. The crucial point I wish to show you is that, in a society like ours, the individual and society are not only not in direct harmony but, in their interests and, one might also say, in their internal composition, stand in such contradiction to each other that this demand for a scientific continuum with a uniform conceptualization does not take us any closer to the matter, or rather deeper into the matter, but instead becomes more superficial at both poles, that of psychology and that of sociology, the more it adapts itself to Parsons's postulate. First, I will express this logically in the simple form that, if Parsons's demand were objectively justified, then the basic categories of society and the social point of view would automatically be the most productive for psychology, and psychological categories would conversely be equally productive for sociology. I have no intention of leaving it at the formal assertion that this is not the case, and I will at least show you briefly in what sense this is not the case, to give you a slightly more concrete notion of what the necessity of dialectics means in the relationship between the individual scientific disciplines. Because I must be brief here, and only grant this matter its appropriate position in these somewhat general reflections on social theory, let me refer to my essay The Relationship Between Psychology and Sociology, 7, which appeared in the volume Sociologica I, the Festschrift for Horkheimer, but also the one of the revision of psychoanalysis from the volume Sociologica II. 8. So those of you who are interested in a further, concrete analysis of this situation should look up these texts. What matters to me here is quite simply that psychology leads deeper into the structure of the individual the more it ignores what could, in a superficial sense, be referred to as social aspects of individual psychology. In the language of analytical psychology, we call this ego psychology. In Freudian theory, the ego is that part of the overall structure of the psyche that largely corresponds to consciousness and whose function in the individual's life process is essentially to test reality, to distinguish between what is in keeping with reality and what is not. According to Freud's very plausibly demonstrated theory, this zone we call the ego, which also reacts to social stimuli in a clear and directly observable manner by acting as the authority that supervises the individual's adjustment to society, is actually an extremely thin layer, while the entire force of the drives, the entire libidinous energy from which the ego energy is simply siphoned off psychogenetically, lies beneath it and is not so willing to participate in this reality testing. So now people have genuinely attempted, and this was primarily the achievement of the various so-called revisionist schools of psychoanalysis, for example that of Karen Horney 9 and that of my former colleague Eric Fromm, 10, or already that of Alfred Adler, 11 if you like, who initiated this form of revisionism, not to analyze the unconscious and thus the fundamental libidinous aspects and development in early childhood but, rather, to focus on the socio-psychological layer and the socio-psychological determinants, which in practice has actually led to some quick therapeutic successes. But it also became apparent that the genuinely deep conflicts, the things truly going on unconsciously inside the individuals, had not been accessed, and that the effects of such a therapy were actually more akin to a form of massage. One could use it to keep people reasonably fit for work and action, but without getting to the truly deep conflicts that lie within them. In other words, one can show in detail that the attempt directly to sociologize psychology failed because individuals in their individual formation are largely archaic and are not connected to the socio-psychological stimuli around them so directly, which, incidentally, corresponds to the thesis of the essentially archaic and, if you will, static character of the unconscious formulated by Freud long before this controversy. This separation of the individual from society, the fact that the individual and its drive energy have remained so archaic that it has not kept up, in a sense, has social reasons itself, namely that same mechanism of universal refusal by culture which has repeatedly imposed not only its ontogenetically but also its phylogenetically archaic layer on them. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the fact is, please pay close attention and do not misunderstand what I am saying as primitive individualism, that this deep layer of the individual is, of course, also of a social nature, that is, the images and fundamental constellations one encounters in the unconscious themselves also refer back to social conflicts. But these social conflicts, as mediated through the father figure, are something completely different, something much older and far less tangible than the immediate ego conflicts one experiences through narcissistic injury, or if one goes through the so-called ego neuroses that so many people suffer from today and which are familiar to all of you under the name inferiority complexes. If not from your own observations, then at least from current phraseology. In other words, what genuinely proves collective and social when one immerses oneself in psychology is not the immediate effect of society on the unconscious here and now, but, rather, a pre-stored, sedimented form of social pressure and social control that is therefore much deeper, much harder to take away, but also impossible to access so readily through changes in social situations. One can conclude from this that, if one were to apply directly the categories of our present society, as attempted by Ms. Horney, for example, to explain psychological conflicts, one would actually reach only external conflicts, not the specifically individual ones beneath them, those where one finds the truly collective conflicts, and this would prove, on the psychological side, that such a uniform concept formation between psychology and sociology is not. On the other hand, the converse applies equally to sociology. For if one attempts, as people have constantly done, and as was the great illusion of Freud himself, to conduct sociology as a form of applied psychology, to think that it is nothing but the application of certain basic psychological categories to the forms and content of socialization, then one can certainly observe some quite productive and appealing things. For example, in Freud's brilliant text Mass Psychology and Ego Analysis, 12, which many of you have no doubt read, where Freud shows that a whole group of behaviors, namely those described by Gustave Le Bon in his Psychologie des Foules, 13, can actually be explained quite adequately by mechanisms of individual psychology. But without wanting to diminish the significance of these findings by Le Bon and Freud in the slightest, and while conceding that they do make excellent contributions to an understanding of mass fascist movements, for example, they all deal only with a relatively limited area of socialization, namely the area where one is really dealing with unconscious or preconscious human reactions in very specific constellations, omitting precisely the aspect that generally determines their social actions, the pressure of social objectivity, mediated in relation to people's consciousness by their own rationale. In other words, wherever we can speak of the social in a specific sense, in the only cases where the constitution of such a special area of social science is actually justified, in fact, one always finds, because of an overall social constitution in which the interests of the individual people and the construction of the whole point in different directions, that the individual people are largely character masks, even where they believe they are acting as psychological persons, where they think they are free, act freely and are identical to themselves, and do only what is dictated by their function, their objective function within society. This, incidentally, is the true reason for the phenomenon that has become so terribly fashionable under the name of the role. 14. Except that the concept of role is so problematic because here something is hypostasized which derives from the structure of society, namely that people in this society have to do something that does not really correspond to who they are, and playing a role literally means that one has to do something, and pretend to be something, that one is not. 15. And, if one leaves out this aspect, the concept of role loses all meaning. This concept of role, which is only explained by the fact that people are forced by the totality of society to act in a particular way that differs from how they would act of their own accord. I am saying that this concept of role, which very much depends on concrete social aspects, is being hypostasized as if the role were some kind of primal quality in the nature of society itself, which is roughly like trying to derive an ontology of reality directly from theater. But I do not wish to say any more about this problem today. I wish to show you in this context only that, if one undertakes such reflections as we are dealing with today, such catchphrases that people now assume can really crack everything open like a safe breaker, like the concept of role, that this is also a highly problematic affair. At any rate, individual psychology does not reach the decisive, socially relevant form of action, namely economic action. And it is strange, and a very clear contrast to Passon's, that important social theorists who normally have extremely divergent views actually agree on this central point, even though my esteemed Harvard colleague Parsons has not, as far as I am aware, acknowledged this yet. Likewise, Marx rejects any attempt at a subjective or psychological reduction of social processes, which are elaborated from the thing to which humans are attached, namely the exchange relationship. Nor does someone like Durkheim, who was a completely differently oriented, very much positivistically oriented sociologist, accept the psychological perspective. Rather, he defines the social, and herein lies something very brilliant in Durkheim's thought, as the aspect of contrainte social. 16 The element of constraint, where society confronts us as something foreign, objectified and reified, something over which we have no power, which he contrasts emphatically with any idea of understanding social motivations, and hence with any psychology. His whole endeavor, the whole effort of Durkheim and the earlier Durkheim school grouped around l'année sociologique, 17 lies precisely in always attributing sociologically relevant facts to social objectivity, which he objectifies to a collective consciousness and not to the individual psyche of separate socially acting humans. In this context especially, I would like to add a word about Max Weber's stance on this problem, which is particularly instructive. Max Weber placed himself, for the very honorable reason that he believed it the task of sociology to understand social action, not simply to register it, in very sharp opposition to Durkheim's aforementioned thesis. He essentially inaugurated the concept of an understanding sociology that attempts, in a certain sense, to follow the overall movement of the positivist era and understand the facts of the subject's socialization from the perspective of the subject, much as Peto 18 did, and in a very similar fashion to how so-called subjective economy, the theory of marginal utility, 19 tried to explain the whole of economic activity in terms of people's subjective needs and thus, ultimately, with their psychology. So in that sense, looking at the matter superficially, you might initially think that Weber's sociology contradicts what I have expounded to you. But, if you look more closely, this is not the case. You will all know that the key concept in Max Weber's thought is that of rationality. I will not address the highly ramified problematic of this concept now but will just point out one aspect that lies within the issues we have been examining in this lecture. For rationality is certainly identical to what I described to you earlier, when I was speaking of psychoanalysis, as the layer of the ego, or of reality testing, and rationality was good fodder for Max Weber, forgive the vulgarity, for it combined two splendid qualities that were virtually irreplaceable for his methodological intentions. On the one hand, rational behavior is understandable. Insofar as a person behaves rationally, we can reconstruct their motivations, the course taken by their behavior. So, let us say that someone is offered a position and then turns it down out of rational considerations, and we are somewhat acquainted with the circumstances. Then we can reflect on these same considerations, and if we give some advice to the person in question and say, "It's better for you not to take the position," then we will usually learn, to our shame, for people are extremely quick in such matters, that they will already have undertaken all the reflections that informed our well-meant advice and, as they are directly affected, will probably have done so much more consistently and rationally than even such worthy sociologists as myself are capable of doing. In that sense, rationality certainly represents the sphere of something understandable. On the other hand, rational social behavior is always the behavior that, as I told you, being adequate to reality, adapts itself more or less completely to the given objective social circumstances. So one generally behaves rationally, by following one's ego principle and not allowing one's drives or one's superego, one's conscience, to dominate, as far as, and only as far as, demanded by the objectively social structure, that is, the prevailing conditions of social production. What is actually mediated by this subjectively understandable rationality is really just the primacy of social objectivity over the subjective drives and the immediate subjective impulses, as highlighted so strongly by such objective theorists of society as Marx or Emile Durkheim, who agreed with him only on this one point. From this perspective, it is surely no coincidence that Max Weber, although he followed a similar concept of understanding to so psychologically disposed a thinker as Dilthey, 20 especially in the name of the objective clarity of the rational, vigorously set his form of sociology apart from psychology. So now, quod erat demonstrandum, this closer examination of the problematics of psychology and sociology has shown that they by no means constitute that continuum, that direct continuum in which psychological and sociological facts can be understood using the same categories. Rather, the opposite is the case. The categories that apply to the one are invalid for the other. As I make this final point, please note that this opposition naturally still contains the same categories, if you will, but that the category which appears positively in the one, science, is negated in the other. In this sense, one can say in all simplicity that there is a true dialectical relationship within the matter itself, and that the attempt by passants to extract or impose on us a form of unified science and unified continuum really leads to nothing but a smoothing over of social and psychological conditions where the opposition, the antagonistic relationship between the individual and society, which is also mirrored in the constitution of the relevant sciences, is simply conjured away in this fashion. Then it looks as if the world of the individual and society were a self-identical, uniform world, and through the predominance of scientific systems, of unified scientific concept formation, the decisive aspect of the matter, its own antagonistic character, is concealed. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that this adequately supports my thesis that so-called methodological questions are not irrelevant to the matter, that not every road leads to Rome, that one cannot proceed like clockwork from psychology to sociology and from sociology to psychology, but that considering the relationship between these disciplines means reflecting on them in such a way that one rises above the semblance of their uniformity and recognizes in the scientific structure those antagonisms which, in reality, obviously stem from the matter itself. In other words, then, and with this I will summarize what I have told you today, through the fact that the method becomes an end in itself, that the methodological scientific demands deduced by Descartes and Leibniz are elevated to criteria of a science, this very method finds itself in tangible opposition to the matter, and one is forced not to act unmethodically but to reflect critically on the concept of method itself. Lecture 12, the 9th of July 1964. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last session we examined the relationship between scientific methodology and the matter itself, and I tried, if I may just recapitulate, to give you a more concrete idea of the thesis that